Puerto Rico, a small island about 1,000 miles from the tip of Florida, is an island with a diverse and sometimes confusing philatelic history. I invite you to join me as I attempt to shed some light on its varied history. Hello, welcome to part 1 of Unraveling Puerto Rico Philately. We'll start with a brief history of the island's founding in the 15th century, followed by a look at the use of postal markings, postage stamps, and postal stationery beginning in the middle of the 18th century and continuing to the present. So let's begin with some island history. The ancient coat of arms of Puerto Rico was first granted by the Spanish crown in 1511. The major symbolism of the coat of arms relates to the dominance of Spain, the strong Roman Catholic influence in the region, and the integrity of Puerto Rico as a colony of Spain. For many, a familiar sight is the guardhouse on the wall of La Fortaleza, guarding the entrance to San Juan Harbor off the Gulf of Mexico. For those of you familiar with U.S. stamps, you will recognize this stamp that was issued in 1971, commemorating the 450th anniversary of the founding of San Juan in 1521. Borinquen, or Boricua, is the name attributed to the Indians of the island, dating back to the Caribs, Arawaks, and the Tainos. The name is translated to Land of Brave Men. Histories of the island were written by Bartholomew de las Casas in the 1550s and Herrera, historian of the royal court, in 1585. Boricua is the popular colloquial name used by Puerto Ricans. Cited by Columbus in 1493, he named the island San Juan Bautista, meaning St. John the Baptist. The settlement of San Juan Bautista began in earnest in 1505 under then-Governor Ponce de Leon. He established the village of Puerto Rico on the North Shore in 1508, which was formally recognized as a town in 1521. It was named Ridgeport since it was the export site for the gold that had been mined in the El Yunque area. Sometime during the 1700s, the names of the island and the town became transposed, with the city becoming San Juan and the island Puerto Rico. The island remained under Spanish control until the outbreak of the Spanish-American War in 1898. That war led to the takeover of Puerto Rico by the Americans with the signing of the Treaty of Paris in December of 1898. The U.S. military controlled the island until 1902, when civil administration was installed under the terms of the Foraker Act. The act provided for a civilian governor appointee by the U.S. President. It did not provide a right to vote in U.S. federal elections. Per the U.S. Constitution, only states admitted to the Union have the election benefit. And U.S. citizenship was granted only for those who served in the United States military. The Jones Act of 1917 granted U.S. citizenship, but maintained the no-vote provision. Puerto Ricans became subject to the military draft as World War I was underway. It reserved for U.S. shipping the import and export of supplies and materials to the island. In 1932, the U.S. Congress passed a bill giving the island the official name of Puerto Rico, beginning in 1933. In 1948, Puerto Ricans were afforded the opportunity to elect their own native-born governor. The U.S. Congress also permitted Puerto Ricans to vote on a plebiscite for statehood or associated Commonwealth status or independence. For 5 elections, islanders flip-flopped between Commonwealth status and association with the United States and statehood status by a margin of 45 to 49%. Supporters of the vote for independence generally never exceeded 4%. A 6th vote held in 2020 was in favor of statehood. The island is approximately 40 miles wide and 111 miles long. It is roughly the same area as the state of Connecticut or that of Lake Maracaibo in Venezuela. Major cities or locales include San Juan, the capital city, Ponce, the second largest city named after the early governor, Bañuelos, which is my family roots, Guanica, the port of Columbus's first landing, and the invasion bay for the United States Navy in July of 1898. Mayagüez, the third largest city and industrial base of the island. Some of the major geological features of the island are El Yunque, the only U.S. tropical national park, La Cordillera Central, the rocky backbone of the island rising to 4,300 feet above sea level. The Cordillera splits the wind of hurricanes and divides agricultural farmland in the south from the sugar-growing lands in the north. The Arecibo Radio Observatory, the second largest in the world, which was damaged in early 2020. For those of you that are familiar with that area, one of the things that was remarkable for me when I've traveled through that area is its remarkable similarity to traveling through Wisconsin. The geological features, the farmland just remind me every time of Wisconsin, which I've traveled through many times in the past. The island is located approximately 1,600 miles from New York City, 80 miles from the U.S. Virgin Islands, 530 miles from Caracas, and 90 miles from the Dominican Republic. The population is approximately 3.2 million, with anthropologists reporting an ethnicity of 30% African, 34% Caucasian white, and 36% Moreno or Trigueño. In English, you might translate that into mulatto. Puerto Rico is a racially diverse society, as can be seen by these percentages. However, the United States Census does not recognize distinctions resulting from interracial marriages. In consequence, the 2015 mid-century survey by the United States Census Bureau found that white was selected by 81% of those surveyed and African by 12%. This brings us to the end of our brief look at island history. Let's now move into what many consider to be a complex overview of the island's philately. Regrettably, catalogers do not provide uniform numbering or descriptive systems that can easily be compared to each other. Therefore, I developed my own handbook, which serves as an album and concordance that was completed in 2010. I never attempted to promote it commercially. In philately, a concordance refers to a tabular representation of common facts involving stamps. It can include philatelic words or numerical listings for postage stamps. It became necessary to develop the concordance to easily compare the offerings of the various catalogs. In this example, on the left page, I show the concordance, while shown on the right-hand side are the corresponding stamps or postal stationery. On the left-hand side can be seen the following: the catalogers, the denomination of the individual stamps, the quantities, other pertinent information relevant to stamps, any numbering by specific catalogers, and colors. The Spanish colonial era ran from 1493 to 1898. During that time, several distinct operational periods existed. In the first 200-year period, mail was not subject to postal regulation. Spanish postal regulation became effective in 1765. At that time, post offices were created for the receipt and delivery of mail. No postage stamps were issued until 1855. The U.S. era began in 1898 to the present with multiple periods. The first of these periods began during the Spanish-American War and was followed by a period using provisional stamps of the United States. Puerto Rican postal correspondence extends back to the earliest Spanish discoveries. Reports by Columbus, Ponce de Leon, and other Caribbean explorers are found in Spain's national archives. These were gradually supplemented by correspondence carried by sea captains and others. The mail system became organized under the 1764 Provisional Regulations of the Spanish Maritime Mail to the East Indies, translated as Reglamento Provisional del Correo Marítimo de España a sus Indias Occidental. Markings such as España and Indias, as well as postal rates, were introduced. Administrative regions were created in 1779, including Las Islas de Barlovento, the Spanish word for the Windward Islands. Beginning with the 21st century, such mail proliferated on Internet websites. This suggests that caveat emptor, namely buyer beware, applies to material of such antiquity. This note of caution will be repeated several times during our presentation. Coincidental to the Napoleonic Wars in the Spanish Peninsula, mail service was severely disrupted in 1802. In 1815, with the exile of Bonaparte, regular mail service was resumed using the Spanish Navy. Puerto Rico was assigned its own set of markings as early as 1802, and other markings came into use, such as caguas, which is equal to or from a town; franco, which meant payment made; sin cargo, which meant without cargo; and such examples as San Tomas, which meant the St. Thomas Island. At times, postal rates such as 5R were hand-stamped on the letter. 5R stands for 5 reales or 5 reales. When stamped in red, the postage had been paid. In 1827, regular mail service to Puerto Rico was negotiated with the Cuban Empresa Maritimo line. All mail carried by Empresa Maritimo was hand-stamped using their own set of markings. Postage rates, such as 5R, when stamped in black, indicated that postage was due. By 1851, the Empresa Maritimo had deteriorated, setting the stage for mail carriage for the soon-to-be-created Ultramar division of the Spanish Post Office. In 1854, the Spanish Post Office created the Ultramar division, meaning land beyond the seas. The Ultramar consisted of the Philippines, the Mariana Islands, Guam, and Cuba and Puerto Rico. The first Ultramar stamp issued was for the Philippines in 1854 and denominated in plata reales. The Ultramar stamps used in Cuba and Puerto Rico followed in 1855. These differed from the stamps of Spain in color and denomination. Use in Puerto Rico was documented under Cuba in Scots until 2013, at which time the issues of Puerto Rico usage were revised by a new statement. That statement of specific Scot numbers is found in the issued under Spanish Dominions section under Cuba. The Cuba-Puerto Rico 1855 issue was printed on loop, watermarked blue paper in 3 values of 1/2, 1, and 2 reales. The 1856 issue was printed on yellow paper with diagonal cross lines in the same 3 values of 1/2, 1, and 2 reales. The 1857 issue was printed on white paper, also in the same 3 values. The 1864 Queen Isabella issue consisted of 4 values. Of the 4 values, only 3 were used in Puerto Rico. Most Puerto Rico postage issues were printed in the National Factory of Stamps in Madrid. Distinct Ultramar issues were used through 1876. Few catalogs agree on the Puerto Rican use of the Ultramar issues, sometimes referred to as Antilles or Spanish West Indies. The 1868 issue was the first perforated stamp used in the Ultramar division. It consisted of 3 values denominated in centimos. The only reliable indicator of use in Puerto Rico is either on cover or with a distinct Puerto Rican town cancel, such as Mayagüez. Throughout this period, correos continued to be used as abbreviated in the four corners of the design. As a side note, the 40 centimos was often used to pay the head tax for slaves. Slavery was abolished in 1873. Each issue has its year printed in the cartouche at the bottom. Three values, 10, 20, and 40 centimos, of the 1868 issue were used in Puerto Rico and overprinted habilitado por la nación, meaning made valid for the nation. In 1868, Queen Isabella abdicated the throne. Her effigy remained on Spanish stamps until February of 1870, after which stamps were issued with and without pictured royalty. The early issues of the 1870s retained correos or ultramar. In all, 8 issues were produced from 1870 to 1876 using these designations. In 1870, the Spain bust allegory issue was produced in 13 values, all of which were used only in Spain. A subset in different values and colors was produced in 10, 20, and 40 centimos denominations for use in Cuba and Puerto Rico. The cataloger, Hugo Storer, claimed the entire set was used as revenue stamps. The 1871 seeded Spain allegory was issued in 4 values, with only 3 used in Puerto Rico, namely the 25 and 50 centimos and the 1 peseta. The 1873 King Amadeo I issue, the first of 2 issues, was produced in 3 denominations, 25 and 50 centimos and 1 peseta. The 50 centimos was issued only as imperforate. This first issue of 1873 was the final stamp released during the ultramar period. Soon after the release of the stamp, Amadeo, the son of Italy's King Emmanuel, abdicated his throne in February of 1873. Postal counterfeits of these stamps exist. With Puerto Rico's separation from Cuba, the independent colonial period in Puerto Rican philately began in 1873. The ultramar designations continued to be used. The first stamp to be issued in this period was the second issue of the King Amadeo I stamp, which was produced in 3 values. This time, the stamp was issued with a para overprint of the then Controller General. Varieties of the para involving the curvature of the V account for the varieties in this set. In 1874, the seeded Spain allegorical stamp of 1871 was issued in 1 value and contained 2 paras, that of a new Controller General and the Capitan General. In 1875, the shield issue was produced in 3 values and also contained the same 2 paras as found on the 1874 issue. The cataloger Billig treats these as counterfeits. King Alfonso XII, son of Queen Isabella, ascended the throne in February of 1873. Not until the 1876 issue did his effigy appear on a stamp. The 1876 issue was the last stamp to retain the ultramar designation and no longer contain the letters CORR in the 4 corners. A theft in early 1876 resulted in the printing of a second issue in June of the same year. A third para overprint was added, that of the Postmaster General. The new issue was produced in 5 values. The cataloger Billig illustrates forgeries. In 1877, the first Puerto Rico label stamp appeared with PTO Rico and the year printed in the cartouche at the top of the stamp and was issued in 5 values. The 1878 issue consisted of 5 values, while the 1879 issue consisted of 6 values. King Alfonso's effigy remained, but the parrots disappear. The engraver's initials JG can be found printed in the neckline of all three issues, but due to considerable plate wear, can sometimes be hard to distinguish clearly. In 1879, Puerto Rico entered the Universal Postal Union with added mailing requirements. Due to currency fluctuations, it is difficult to compare rates between Spain, its colonies, and the rest of the world between 1850 and 1880. The cataloger Billig claims that errors are color proofs or waste, and muestra overprints exist. Billig also shows counterfeits of all these issues. The independent post office period is notable for its issues of King Alfonso XII and his successor, King Alfonso XIII, as both the baby and teen king. The multiple releases of King Alfonso XII and King Alfonso XIII account for nearly 190 values of the roughly 250 postage stamps issued for Puerto Rico by Spain. In the 1880 King Alfonso XII issue, the full spelling of Puerto Rico was included in the cartouche at the top of the stamp, replacing the abbreviated PTO Rico that was used in the 1877 to 1879 issues. It was issued in 13 values, reflecting the increased mailing requirements of the UPU. Double impressions of the bust can be found on the 15 centimos stamp. The 1881 issue reflected the change in denomination from peseta to peso. Like the 1880 issue, it was also issued in 13 values. The 1882 issue removed the year from the cartouche. It was issued in 15 values. Double impressions of 4 and 8 millesimas can be found, and an 8 centavos color error exists involving yellow. The 1884 issue was released in 4 values. The 3 and 8 centavos are also found in setenant pairs. The 1886 issue was released as a single value of 5 centavos. It contained retouches around the vignette and in the hairline. For some reason, the Scott catalog uses the term retouch in lieu of varieties. In 1890, following the death of King Alfonso XII in 1885 and the birth of his son King Alfonso XIII in 1886, Spain issued the first of 4 issues with the effigy of the baby king. All 4 issues are poorly centered, and the engraver's name Julia can be found in the baseline of the bust. Sperati and Fournier forgeries can be found in all 4 issues. Imperforates exist, although the cataloger Billig identifies them as printer's waste. The 1890 issue was released in 15 values. According to the cataloger Billig, a fire in a San Juan warehouse greatly reduced the supply of 5 values, specifically the values 4, 6, and 8 millesimas, and the 40 and 80 centavos. The 1892 issue was released in 16 values. Many were used as revenue and fiscal stamps, notably the 8 centavos. The cataloger Billig identifies a defective Rico in the 4 millesimas stamp. The 1894 issue was released in 14 values. Between 300,000 and 3 million stamps in each value was printed. The cataloger Billig notes that the 20 and 40 centavo stamps were used as telegraph stamps and were sometimes hole punched. The 1896 issue was released in 15 values. 3 million stamps of each value were printed, with the exception of the 40 and 80 centavo stamps. Only 10,000 80 centavo stamps and 50,000 40 centavo stamps were printed, making both very rare. Even though they are considered part of the 1896 issue, the 3 and 80 centavo stamps were actually printed in 1897. Both muestra and ministerio overprints can be found in all issues. Only the cataloger Hugo Storer claims that the printings of the 1877 to the 1897 period included essays. Looking back at the 1894 issue, there is a scarce margin error. On the 1 milésima de peso, there is an inadvertent inclusion of Filipinas instead of Puerto Rico. In commemoration of the 400th anniversary of Columbus's discovery, Puerto Rico issued the El Barquito stamp on November 19, 1893, for use only on that day. It was the sole stamp designed and printed on the island, as of Perforation 12. 20,000 stamps were printed before destruction of the printing plate. The catalogers Rex Scaly and Hugo Storer make unfounded assertions that the printing plate was not immediately destroyed, but rather used for a second printing for a perf 11.5 by 12. Proofs were produced in 12 colors. A variety of counterfeits exist and are best illustrated and explained by Billig and other references. Forgeries involving cover usage are common. A comprehensive discussion of this stamp issue can be found on Facebook by searching for Boat Friends and El Barquito. In 1898, the King Alfonso XIII Teen King series was released in 20 volumes. Despite showing 1899 in the cartouche, this year is irrelevant since Spanish forces had withdrawn from the island in 1898. All of the values are known in perforate and imperforate. The cataloger Billig claims imperforates are printer's waste. The cataloger Rex Scaly claims that they are proofs. The name of the designer or the engraver, Mora, can be seen at the bottom edge of the neck. Overprint forgeries exist. One example is where the overprint is above the cancellation, a questionable stamp only listed by Storer. Other examples are Pinelli forgeries, which are easy to identify since the cancel color is faint and lacks details. Muestra overprint copies also exist. Due to the short time that this issue was in use, used stamps are scarce and mint stamps are plentiful. Two unusual printings occur in the Teen King issue. The first involves the insertion of a Filipinas cartouche in the 1 centavo value. The second involves a Tete Bêche pair, also in the 1 centavo value. A Tete Bêche pair comprises two stamps where one of the stamps is inverted. Please note that these stamps serve for both postage and telegram purposes. The events that led to the use of overprints by the Spanish in 1898 began with the start of the Spanish-American War on April 21st of that year. On that date, the U.S. blockade on Cuba began. That blockade was followed by the blockade of San Juan Harbor on May 12, 1898. With disruption of supplies to the island, Spanish postal authorities had to use old stock for their general mail needs. They created overprint hand stamps and with the use of rose ink instructed the postmasters to begin using overprints on June 7th. The U.S. land invasion began on July 25th at Guanica and ended with the signing of a peace protocol on August 13th. During the transition period from August to mid-October, many parts of the island remained unoccupied by U.S. troops. Negotiations began for Spanish withdrawal from the entire island on September 9th. On September 29th, the Spanish governor ceded control of Puerto Rico, effective October 17th. On October 18th, the last of the Spanish troops set sail for Spain, turning over full control of the island to U.S. forces. The absence of local Spanish authority allowed the overprint materials to fall into private hands. The Treaty of Paris was signed on December 9th, ending the Spanish-American War. The U.S. blockade necessitated that Spanish authorities overprint stocks of unused postage for mail in areas not overrun by U.S. troops. The overprinting mainly involved the Baby King stamps. That period of use began on or about June 7th and lasted only until October 17th of 1898. The habilitado para 1898 y 1899 overprint translates into good for use in 1898 and 1899. In fact, the overprint was only usable in 1898. The materials distributed for overprinting included rose ink. Hand stamping led to many irregularities. Forgeries do exist and in many cases do not look anything close to what the normal imprint should look like. Forgeries can exhibit missing, smudged, or strange-looking letters and numbers. By way of an anecdote, while visiting Puerto Rico in 2002 and the clubhouse of the Sociedad Philatelica de Puerto Rico, a member explained to me how the period from 1899 to 1903 became the heyday of stamp counterfeiting as a cottage industry in Puerto Rico. The reason for this is that that period of counterfeiting was fueled by American demands for postage stamps of any kind of Puerto Rico. The legal use of Spanish stamps ended October 17, 1898, with the U.S. takeover. Due to the frequent illegal overprinting of leftover stock, the cataloger Billig classifies the overprint issue as extremely difficult to expertise. The cataloger Hugo Storer identifies 96 varieties of the overprint, which include 30 varieties using ink other than rose, varieties with inverted hand stamps, and varieties with multiple application of the hand stamp. Skepticism is warranted in light of the large number of varieties. 2 overprints for this period can be found, none of which have any documentary evidence. Storer is the sole cataloger listing these provisional overprints. Edifill had a listing for them until 1984, when they were removed. One of these overprints is the diagonal provisional for 1898 and 1899. The habilitado overprint allegedly makes reference to the date of the Spanish troop withdrawal. Another type of postage used during the war was war tax stamps. On May 8th, 13 stamps were released using the overprint Impuesto de Guerra, which translates to war tax. War tax stamps are a special overprint placed on mail to defray postal expenses during wartime. 6 values were released with no surcharge. 1 value was released with an additional surcharge of 2 centavos for mail, while 6 values were released with an additional surcharge of 5 centavos for telegrams. The Edifill catalog lists 32 values, while the cataloger Hugo Storer lists 116 values. Why this huge disparity cannot be explained. Ay Bonito was the furthest advance of American troops to the northeast from Guanica. These war tax stamps continued to be used in the northeast region until mid-October. Puerto Rico used postage that was outside the mainstream. The following is a brief insight into 2 of these instances before closing the Spanish era. The first consists of the use of government official stamps. Official stamps of Spain for government business use only were used in Puerto Rico from 1857 until 1867. After 1867, we have no information regarding the use of Spanish official stamps in Puerto Rico. These stamps are imperforate, with specific colored paper for each value. To establish use in Puerto Rico, they must be on cover containing references to Puerto Rico. Local government official seals proliferated. These were applied with rubber stamps and black ink. Many are smudged. Unfortunately, there are no references to local officials, so buyer beware. The second instance of mail outside the mainstream was consular post of both Great Britain and France. In 1843, Great Britain and Spain agreed beginning in 1844, to permit the processing of mail from the British consulate in San Juan. Such mail was shipped to Great Britain and Europe on monthly voyages. Two types of cancellations were used between 1844 and 1864, the split ring cancel and the crown cancel. Beginning in 1865, the British consulate in San Juan replaced the split ring and crown cancels with an alphanumeric coded cancel of C61 on British stamps. Starting in 1873, other British consulates on the island were added to the mail arrangement, each using a unique alphanumeric code, including F85 for Mayagüez, F88 for Ponce, F84 for Aguadilla, F83 for Arroyo, and 582 for Naguabo. In 1873, France agreed with Spain, permitting the French consulates to process mail bound for France and Europe. The consulates used a distinctive octagonal cancellation. This arrangement ceased in 1877. The H.R. Harmer auction of March 25, 2006, shows this as among the most expensive Puerto Rico philatelic material available. This French agreement was terminated in 1877. Very similar cancellations appear after 1877, which are not consular mail. French shipping lines from Puerto Rico were split into 6 lines serving the Caribbean, with each line applying its own cancellation. The example shown bears the date of 1885 and the name of shipping line B. With the U.S. takeover of the island, 4 different periods of postage and revenue stamp use occurred. From mid-1898 to 1900, the U.S. military processed both military and civilian mail. Provisional mail arrangements for the U.S. military ground troops were conducted between July and September of 1898 using military stations. Formal military station processing was permitted in September for military personnel mail and in October for the processing of civilian mail. Beginning in March of 1899, civilian mail was to be processed by the independent Puerto Rico branch of the U.S. Post Office. However, civilian mail was simultaneously being processed by military stations until May of 1899, when this overlap ended. With the end of the independent postal period in 1900, Puerto Rico came under the full jurisdiction of the U.S. Post Office, which continues to this day. With the exception of U.S. excise revenue stamps, postage stamps used in Puerto Rico are regular U.S. postage stamps. Beginning in 1948, the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico began issuing revenue stamps which are unique to the island and some of which are used to this day. The American invasion and gradual advance over much of Puerto Rico disrupted postal communications. Mayors requested of military authorities permission to operate courier services between towns. Once permission was granted, mayors authorized local issues which took on a sort of provisional status. Cuamo and Ponce are the best examples. These have remained a center of contention as to whether they were postally authorized or not and are considered scarce. According to the cataloger Billig, both genuine and counterfeits exist. So in this case, buyer beware. Further detail can be found in Preston and Sanborn's article in the June 1937 American Philatelist. These controversies have continued, as illustrated by discussions of the book on the Spanish-American War by Bill DiPaolo in 2018. Other local markings can be found, but documentation as to authorization is sparse. Examples include those of Guanica, Mayagüez, Utaldo, and Carolina. Local markings can also be found for Yauco, Arjunas, Rio Piedras, and Yayuyas. The sparse documentation for such locals during the U.S. administration raises realistic concerns as to their legitimacy, and again, the buyer should beware. Military stations served the purpose of post offices. The military stations provided the means by which, beginning in May of 1898, military and naval personnel could communicate via the post in the absence of an American postal system. And in September 1898, military stations became the means by which civilians on the island could also communicate. In March 1899, the independent Puerto Rico Post Office was created, and along with the military stations, served both populations. Concurrent service ended in May 1899 with the termination of the military station. Any stamp would do for franking, as seen in this October 1898 military station number 4 example, using a Puerto Rico stamp and a U.S. stamp. Military station markings were also applied after establishment of the independent Puerto Rico Post Office by the U.S., as seen on the April 1899 military station number 4 example. Beginning in mid-March 1899, the Washington, D.C. Post Office began direct U.S. Post Office operations through the creation of an independent Puerto Rico Post Office branch. This arrangement continued until May 1st of 1900. The most recognizable feature of this period involved U.S. overprinting of the bureau issues of the 1890s. Overprints consisted of the words Puerto or Puerto Rico at 25 and 36-degree angles on both regular and postage due stamps. 5 Puerto Rico overprints received specimen markings, most likely for UPU participating nations. In deference to the U.S. Congress, 1 million stamps bearing Puerto were printed, while 2 million bearing Puerto were printed because of post office preference. Both versions were distributed for use only in Puerto Rico. The cataloger billing illustrates counterfeit types, while the Scott catalog and Storer note misspellings of Puerto Rico. Examples of covers used during the U.S. independent Puerto Rico Post Office period include this illustrated cover from the Hotel Inglaterra and this cover from Las Marias, Puerto Rico. Both are used during the period March 1899 to May 1900. The Hotel Inglaterra was the base of the American commissioners who negotiated the peace treaty. Military stations operated during the U.S. independent post office period, as is quite evident by the cancellations on this front. In this example, mail was sent from Military Station Number 4 in July and returned to Military Station Number 4 in November of 1899, bypassing the independent post office branch. The recipient could not be located. The Foraker Act of 1900 called for the installation of a civilian government effective April 17, 1900. The military stations and the independent Puerto Rico postal branch ceased on May 1st of 1900. The Puerto Rico overprint stamps were reserved for use in Puerto Rico. Here is a case of the overprinted stamp being improperly used for mail from California. Postal stationery was introduced worldwide in 1870 and continues to this day. In the case of Puerto Rico, such stationery was authorized by the Spanish government and the U.S. government during their respective periods of administration of the island. Between 1875 and 1898, Spain issued 4 different postal card designs, the first of which was the King Alfonso XII 1875 issue, released in only the 25 centimos value. In 1885 and 1887, the second design was released in 2 issues of the same value of 3 centavos. The decade of the 1890s saw the release of the third design featuring the Baby King. 4 issues were released, one in 1890, one in 1892, another in 1894, and the fourth in 1896. The 1890 issue was released in one value, as was the 1892 issue. On the other hand, the 1894 and 1896 issues were released in two values each. The fourth design was that of the Teen King. The cartouche shows that the issue was available for both 1898 and 1899, but in fact was available only in 1898. It was released as one issue with 8 values. A prominent feature of this issue is variations in the spacing of the first 2 lines. Used postal cards are worth considerably more than mint versions. 4 reply cards were released. To be complete, reply cards must have both the forwarding segment and the reply card segment attached. In consequence, finding complete used reply cards is problematic compared to complete mint reply cards. During the late 1890s, it is estimated that 5,000 of the Boricua immigrated to the Hawaiian Islands to work sugarcane fields. Few returned to Puerto Rico. An estimated 30,000 descendants still reside in the islands. This postcard may be connected to the beginnings of that immigration. As an aside, the Puerto Rican music of Hawaii can be found in a Smithsonian Institution recording. Stamp collecting was the subject of this 1895 postal card from San Juan to New York. It advertised the Spanish-language magazine El Puerto Rico Philatelic. It is addressed to Nassau Street, heart of the stamp dealers' district, until the 1960s. Postal cards were repurposed by affixing the proper postage for mail in the United States. The left example was used by an instructor to provide a student his grades with the use of a 1-cent Washington on a Baby King postal card. The right example was correspondence between stamp dealers using a Teen King postal card repurposed with a 1-cent Ben Franklin. In 1898, 2 postal cards were produced by the U.S. with one variant. Puerto Rico was the spelling used on one issue with a length variant of the word Puerto. Puerto Rico was the spelling used on the second issue. During the period of the U.S. independent Puerto Rico branch, 7 different embossed envelope designs were released in 18 variants. Variants include different effigies of U.S. presidents, different spellings of the word Puerto and Puerto, and different colors. There were only 4 values used, namely the 1 cent, 2 cent, 4 cent, or 5 cents. Many are associated with military stations. Here is a Scott U3 example, released in 1898 with a carmine-colored embossed stamp and lettering and a 36-degree overprinted stamp. It was mailed from San Juan on July 8, 1899, to New York City, care of General Delivery at the Park Row and Broadway Post Office. The letter was unclaimed and returned to Military Station No. 4 for return to the sender. This 5-cent blue President Grant, Scott No. U4, was released in 1898 with a blue embossed Puerto Rico. 10,000 were released, in contrast to the 100,000 of U3. In 1899, the U11 2-cent postal envelope embossed with a red Puerto Rico was released. Variations occur in the length of the Puerto Rico inscription. During the war, the U.S. introduced embossed envelopes that could be ordered by business firms with their company name in the corner. Among the first printed-to-order U.S. postal envelopes in 1898 were 500 printed for the firm Roses & Company. These were part of the 3,000 Scott U1s produced. The Scott U1 features a black Puerto Rico inscription and a green George Washington. Another printed-to-order example is illustrated by the Scott U3 printed for Fritz Lundy. The Scott U3 features a Carmen, George Washington, and Puerto Rico inscription. Used to bundle individual newspapers, one wrapper was produced for Puerto Rico. Although catalogs show no difference in papers, visual inspection shows that two different papers were used. The left example is much brighter than the right. The wrapper on the right is a front. In addition to the embossed stamp, several Puerto Rico overprinted stamps were applied. The newspaper was addressed to a New York City stamp dealer on Nassau Street. During the U.S. regular operations period, U.S. stamps were issued honoring Puerto Rico and its association status. These were used throughout the United States and Puerto Rico. Approximately 15 such stamps were produced. The latest example includes the 2016 special delivery stamp featuring the Indian Cave or La Cueva del Indio. U.S. federal excise stamps have been printed by the U.S. for the past century. These are covered in Part 2 under revenue stamps. The Commonwealth of Puerto Rico issued internal revenue stamps only. These are also covered in Part 2. In Part 2, we will present the following: papeleta and papel sellado, postal history, commercial postcards in contrast to the governmental issued postal cards that we discussed earlier, airmail, revenue stamps, Cinderellas, and U.S. stamps involving Puerto Rico. If time permits, we will also touch upon cancellations and alternative markings, jet mail, and U.S. Navy ships. A number of references are found in my album, but are not mentioned here. All such references can be found in the must-have book by Dr. Ronald Gonzalez, Bibliografía Philatelica de Puerto Rico. A number of very useful references have also been published subsequent to Dr. Gonzalez's book, as seen here. This concludes Part 1 of Unraveling Puerto Rico Philately. I invite you to continue your exploration of the many facets of Puerto Rico's philately by joining me in Part 2. Thank you for watching.